But that point around the Scope 3 emissions is very interesting, because a lot of real estate funds and asset owners, a lot of their Scope 3 is actually within the tenants themselves. So the people occupying those floor spaces. And so there needs to be an element of proactive engagement with those tenants, having visibility of what the tenants are consuming, and working with them to understand what their own targets are.
Yeah, well, you'll recall from just a few moments ago, we had a conversation with a major, global asset manager in the real estate world, and one of the things I suggested in that conversation was that the whole relationship with tenancy and owner has to change, because in many multiple occupancy, high-rise commercial buildings, if a tenant is actually doing certain things on one level of the building that is dragging heat or cooling disproportionately for their use for the other end of the building, then all of a sudden the whole building is out of sync. So it becomes more of an agreement specific that says, as a tenant, I have responsibility beyond just actually taking bums on seats in a call center or an office space. The way I occupy that space, the way I behave in that space, the way I take decisions responsibly because of the whole benefit of the entire space is increasingly important.
Yeah.
So it's one illustration of why getting to net zero by 2030 or 2040 or whatever date you fix is hard, because it's not just about changing a gas boiler for a heat pump. It's about the way we all behave in society. You can look at it, electrification of cars and vehicles, etc. People are doing that because it's becoming accessible. Happens to be that not many people are looking at the impacts of that globally in terms of mineral resources, etc., because that's a whole big issue. But everything has cause and effect. Yeah. So we all need to be engaged, and tenancy agreements will definitely play a part in that.
Yeah. And we've seen it actually, post-COVID, probably the actual leases in terms of leaseholds are up, or quite close back to pre-pandemic levels, but the actual occupancy level, so the physical numbers of people in any building, they're now much more migratory in terms of how they utilize those spaces. So maybe certain days of the week there's nobody within the office, and other days it's almost full to capacity.
Well, and I think we've all seen examples of, especially if you take cities like Dublin or London or elsewhere, you'll have a floor where an organisation has demanded that people are present in the office, so that you have near normal occupancy, which pre-pandemic, so you might have something like 90% of the office population in the office Monday to Friday. You may have 2 or 3 other floors that were designed for that level of occupancy that may have 20 or 30%. So when you're actually looking at the whole balance of the airflows and thermostats playing against each other, in that building, there is a dynamic that people had not factored when that building was designed, even if it is a relatively new building. Within the last 5 to 10 years, it's occupancy, and the way that occupancy utilizes the space plays a huge part in the demands on that building.
Yeah, and incredibly influential actually on what that baseline of energy consumption is going to be. And that's why it's accurate to get into the detail of that, to understand how the building is operating, not just take the assumptions of people that are in there.
Yeah,
You've got a challenge.
You have to look at it as a dynamic space. I mean, it's absolutely not static. Well, if you design the building across the road, the building we're in today, for this moment in time, what I can tell you for absolute sure, tomorrow it's going to be different, because the outside ambient temperature will be different. The footfall might be different. The space here that we're sat next to might be occupied for some kind of function. It is dynamic, and the building, its carbon credentials, for want of a better phrase, has to be capable of managing that responsibly. It's not just a one-time fit and forget. It has to be dynamically responsible throughout.
And part of a continuous improvement process, which ultimately is what net zero carbon will mean. It's not going to be just a raft of projects that once implemented are there and fixed in time, because as you said, the building is dynamic. So the systems have to be operating in a dynamic function. And ultimately that means that things in terms of energy intensity and carbon intensity will still vary.